Hey there, listener. Have you ever felt dissatisfied in your relationship, maybe resentful and frustrated, and wondering, how can I turn this around? How can I get my partner to see what needs to change? And how do I get that change to occur? I'm here today with relationship guide Kristy Scher, and we are going to talk about what gets in the way of those changes in our relationship. And kind of little spoiler here, it has more to do with you and your internal somatic experience than what other people are doing or not doing. So stay tuned. Every day there is a forgetting, and every moment there is the possibility of remembering. Remembering who you truly are, awakening to your body, to the inner world, to the experience of being alive. Here is where you find the beauty, the joy, and here is where you free your soma. I'm your host, Amy Takaya. I'm here to help you move from pain to power, from tension to expansion, and ultimately from fear to love. Hi, Kristy. Good to see you finally.
Hi, Amy. So awesome to be here with you.
Fantastic. Yes, I've been really loving just like witnessing your content and what you share. You talk a lot about going from chronically dissatisfied in your relationships to how do we turn that around inside of ourselves to become, and I love this phrase, this word, adored, to become an adored woman who feels that sense of being adored and appreciated and nurtured and all of those things that we want, right, in our relationships as women. And I love
Mhm.
that you have a really empowering take on all of this. So I want to open with a question to kind of get this conversation started because there's so much ground we can cover here, right? But why is it so hard for us, maybe, in this conversation as women, to see that the change has to happen in us and that it isn't our partner that needs to do all these things? Why is that so hard to accept that maybe it's me?
Yeah, I just love this question. And there's a couple of things I will say just before I answer this, and just know that that is actually part of my style. I'm going to probably tell you five stories to make one point. And I want to acknowledge that it really can be for a lot of women, it can be so hard to get this. I actually want to affirm that that is actually, in my opinion, part of the way. And so it's not wrong.
Mm.
And the more we can find our experience right, the easier it is to keep moving forward. And I don't mean right like be attached to it, but like to not find it wrong is so important. That said, the word adored, or the term that I have come to use, adored woman, is slightly cheeky in the sense that it sounds like it's about how other people see us. And one thing when people hang out with me, they understand and get to know is that I am very irreverent. I love contradiction. And so adored is really meant to sort of pique our desire. And usually it's that what I hear from a lot of women is maybe they don't use the word adored. Maybe they use the word like, I want to be wanted, or I want to feel desired. And it's not just women. I actually have heard this from a lot of men too. But that wanting something from outside to come in, I think that that is actually a really beautiful and necessary want and desire. I think it's part of how we are made as relational beings. And there is something, and you use the word empowered, there is something that's not empowered in that stance. I think it is actually the wish of a very young part of us. It may be something that was unfulfilled or unresponded to or unresponded to enough that we brought it with us from childhood into our adulthood and still had this longing that there be something outside of us that reached towards us. And for me, the way of the adored woman really is a process of, first and foremost, sort of emotional maturation, which sounds very dry and uninteresting, but we can make it more juicy. But it is a process of really learning how to be the, I call it sort of first orientation, that we are the center of our relational world. How can we not be? And when we learn how to actually act in that way, so it's not a theory, it's really about how we show up and how we move in the world. When we can learn how to stay rooted in ourselves, have standards and relational non-negotiables, really self-attune, self-nurture, be self-loving, then we actually can move in a way that is empowered. So we actually can make choices and have discernment. And though all of that piece of, it's what I call, there are 3 pillars to the way of the adored woman. And that's really the first pillar, which is self-fluency. Mm-hmm. When we have that self-fluency, it's about our relationship with ourself. That really starts to change our relational world profoundly, such that we could receive someone moving toward us. I'm sure that there's a lot in that.
Yes. I mean, the first thing I thought was that, especially with this idea that it's a younger part of ourselves that was like undernourished, right? And that is still hungry and craving that connection and that attention that it didn't get, right? That actually speaks to why it's so hard, is because it's exercising a part of our brain, a part of our consciousness that, not that it's weak, but just it hasn't been doing what we're starting to ask it to do, which is self-regulate and self-soothe. And that is very hard when we're in the beginning of a new thing. I love this. I don't know how much you know about like the I Ching, but like there's the I Ching number 3 has this principle of difficulty in the beginning. And it's just true. It's just a universal truth of anything that we do. In the beginning, there's challenge. You can think about like the birthing process of like coming into the world, right? But it's true of like all those times when we are pivoting and switching the direction, maybe changing the neural pathway of how we've done something for so long, this orientation you're speaking of, to like, going from a third person orientation of ourselves and like, the world has things that we are lacking and we need to go get it from other people, right? To a first person orientation of it's actually in me and I can source my inner soul's nutrition and my love from my own beingness, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not an easy thing when we've been oriented the other way our whole lives.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know anything about the I Ching, but I love that you just mentioned the number 3, because I think that there is something, there might be a thread that goes throughout our conversation, because I have 3 pillars to the way of the adored woman. That is very deliberate. Also, that in a relationship, there's you, there's me, and then there's us, or the we, or some people call it the third, or
Yes.
that there's a third. And that third consciousness, which is the we, different people talk about it in different ways. Stan Tatkin might talk about it in terms of like the relational sort of space, or being able to tend the sort of collaborative team-like experience. But that third, to be able to access that and really tend that, we have to have ourself. I'm going to so date myself with some of my language, but like we have to have our relationship with ourselves on fleek. We have to have it down. Like we have to be really, as you said, the capacity to sort of to be regulated, and I think of it as sort of grounded. And I love the way that Julianne Shore talks about it as actually having an integrated brain.
Mm-hmm.
Which means like I actually know the various parts of me. Like I understand that when I'm triggered, I am in my adaptive child. I'm in my adaptations. I'm in my strategies that I learned at a very young age to navigate a relational world that I came into. And those, as Terry Real, who's my teacher, would say, what was adaptive then becomes maladaptive later. And so the same part of our brain that we that grew in our earliest relationship experiences is the same part of our brain that we use for our adult primary attachment relationship. Mm-hmm. So if we came up in a relational system like I did, that was very dysfunctional, if it resulted in us having to contort ourselves, having to close off parts of ourselves, having to either dissociate or, which I certainly did. I spent a lot of my childhood dissociated. If our relational system was impoverished or like characterized by scarcity, we will have an orientation to love that has some adaptation around scarcity. And that might either be dependence or avoidance.
Right, right. Hyper independence, where we don't know how to receive and we don't know how to, really give and take and that reciprocity, right? When we're hyper. I speak for myself here because I thought, like, when I first read about like attachment theory and stuff, and maybe you can weigh in on this, I thought, oh, I have an anxious attachment. And then when I actually started looking at like some of my patterns, and some of the ways that I like did things when I was younger, I'm like, oh, actually, I have a very avoidant pattern, right? And I think that we also fluctuate and like different situations and circumstances bring out different things enough. Just different people bring out different parts of us, right? Like just as an example, like I looked back on one of these relationships I had in my early adulthood. I was like 18, and I broke up with a guy by just simply never calling him back. And I'm like,
Oh, the things
oh
we do.
my God. Like I looked back on that and I'm like, that is like so terrible, like I can't even imagine like how that must have felt for him, like what kind of mindset I must have had to be in to be doing something so heartless like that. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so sometimes I think we have a perspective that we're in ourselves about how things are, and it might take, like you say, some maturing and some connecting with ourselves to actually have the perspective to go, oh, wait a minute, like I know I was all up in my, story of how it is, but there was also another person who was having an independent experience of me and what I was doing, and I impacted them, right?
Yeah.
Did you know that your muscles are holding on to thoughts, memories, and feelings? If you have a tight neck or back, you're not just getting old, you're experiencing a buildup of tension from the life you've lived. Most people don't know this, but there is a part of your brain that can reverse and prevent chronic tension. When you relax your muscles, you not only move better and regulate your nervous system, but you also free yourself from the grip the past has over your body. So you can live with freedom, confidence, and enjoy your life now. How does that sound? Join me, Amy Takaya, and discover what my clients are raving about at youcanfreeyoursoma.com.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we can have a variety of experiences, and, I always say like the sort of first rule of the way of the adored woman is know thyself. So it is that sort of first orientation, the self-fluency thought, because I actually was a highly anxious person. And that became clearer and clearer over my life that anxiety was a big thing. I would have thought that I was anxious, but one of the ways that I really behaved was actually to be very walled off and shut down. And looking back, my husband and I talk about this a lot because our relationship has been so profoundly changed in the last 5 years. It looks nothing like the previous 25. And both of us are like, how the hell did we get here? And like, I frequently will ask him, like, what exactly, like I keep asking me, like, what exactly happened? Because I love to reverse engineer things. But one of the things that I realized in retrospect is that I thought I was asking for what I needed. I thought I was asking for what I wanted. I thought I was expressing myself. I thought I was being revealed. And that is completely not true. Like, I think in a lot of ways, I was very unreadable. That was actually part of my strategy. And the more I work with women and couples, it's fascinating. Like, the more I've learned about how to work with women and couples and really support people to come forward through self-defining, self-revealing, vulnerably holding ourselves as we express our needs, wishes, wants, longings, preferences, beliefs, like to really come forward in order to be meetable, seeable, feelable. Most of the women that I work with do the same thing that I did, which is she thinks she's being revealing, but she's really not. Like she thinks she's expressing a wish and doing it vulnerably, but it's, we learn a lot of ways, I think, depending on our relational world, we might learn a lot of ways to cloak, to sort of tame it down, temper it, make it palatable so that it is very possible that my husband never really felt who I was and what I wanted until I really learned how to feel that, stay with that, and
Inside
express it
yourself.
from inside myself, and express it from a place that was both self-approving and self-affirming, so that I could really tolerate being fully seen. Because before that, probably what I was doing, in fact, I'm certain what I was doing was actually expressing my desires as a criticism or
As a
complaint.
complaint, right? Yeah. I was thinking that as you were talking, my husband and I have been married now. It'll be our seventh wedding anniversary in June, and
Oh,
we've been
so nice.
together for 8 years. So we got married a year from the date that we started hanging out.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, we technically met
Beautiful.
like in March, like as a little random meeting and thought we'd never see each other again, and then ended up meeting each other again in June at the same coffee shop that I like never went to.
Oh.
Very strange kind of happenstance thing. But there's been so many ups and downs for us, even within the 7 years that we've been
Mhm.
together. And I've gone through these, I guess it almost feels like these phases of like opening and then closing, and like both of us opening and like finding each other and then closing off and like distance again and then like challenge and then like, and so much of it comes back to what you're saying, which is how connected and I'm going to use this word, but I want it to like be taken the right way. Like I'm not using it in a judgy way. It's more like in a structural way that I'm talking about it. But like how much integrity am I with my self-care, with my pouring my energy into myself, and same for my husband, because all of those things impact us. If I
Mhm.
am not taking care of myself and he's not taking care of himself, right? Like I gave an analogy like this to my son, and maybe other people can like relate, or maybe a little light bulb will go off. We looked back on some of the times earlier in our relationship when we would have these really dramatic blowout fights.
Mhm.
And it was like we were driving, through like LA traffic, which is like stressful or something,
Oh,
right?
that
And we
sounds
like
awful.
hadn't had anything to eat. So we like were hungry. And then we'd stop at like a cafe and we'd have like a piece of pie and coffee. So we'd get ourselves like sugared up and caffeined up with our nervous systems already like, and then we'd have some really huge blowout fight over like some misunderstanding in the conversation, and it was result in, all kinds of like drama. And we became like aware of that dynamic within ourselves, like after a few times of it happening, and we kind of looked back and we're like, this is a pattern when we like haven't nourished, like literally haven't nourished our bodies. We're putting
Hmm.
ourselves through the stress of like being out and about for a long time. And then we don't give ourselves the things that we really need. We give ourselves like a bunch of sugar and caffeine.
Hmm.
And I think at one point we even had like a ridiculous rule where it was like, okay, well, only one person can drink coffee while we're out together, so that like there'll be one person who's like grounded while the other person's like, whacked out on caffeine, but these
I
are
love
just kind
that.
of like the funny dynamics that like we don't realize how much, what we're doing with our physical body and what we're doing internally with our way of being towards ourselves, being towards what's happening impacts how we show up in our relationship, right?
Yeah. So I sort of imagine, I envision that like these three fluencies are what I talk about in The Way of the Adored Woman. One is self-fluency, one is relational fluency, and the third is emotional fluency. And I separate that for some very specific reasons because there's so much in it. As I'm listening to you, one of the things that I was, that I became aware of, and again, I think some of this is just a matter of age and experience and your sort of orientation to learning from your own experiences. But I didn't know that I was dysregulated, or like that my baseline was essentially like agitated and in my adaptations. I did not
Yes.
know that that was sort of my baseline. And probably about I want to say maybe 16 years ago I got sober. And part of what happened for me in getting sober, and I've written about this a lot, and I think it's so important to talk about this because the journey of motherhood can be so hard for so many women. But one of the things that I realized was that I was angry all the time.
Mm.
And the first year that I was sober, I was angry all the time. And I was like just waking up to the fact that I was angry all the time. And it was really, really hard to see. The second year of sobriety, I was angry all the time and I knew it. I could say, yep, I'm angry. Like I could actually identify it. And the third year that I was sober, I could see when I was angry and I could stop myself from acting on it. And it was in that time I was still working as a nurse. I was a perinatal nurse and neonatal nurse and lactation consultant for 12 years. And it was in that time that I started to notice basically when I would lose my shit. And part of my, I guess, addiction or non-sobriety was that I raged a lot. Like I caused a lot of harm to my kids for a period of their life. And I started to notice, because I was also raising a kid who had a lot of intensity. You know, I love both my sons. They're amazing adults. They're both single right now, by the way. Putting that out there, calling in the beautiful, wonderful women. But like in raising particularly, one of my sons who was just like, he was just like an intense cat, and I mean that so lovingly because I am too. But I started to look at like, when would things go off the rails for me? Like, when would I lose my shit? And I remember this so vividly because I used to be the kind of woman who, like, I would come home from a 12-hour shift, which is really more like a 13-hour shift at the hospital. And I would pull in the driveway and I'd walk in the house and there would be one cup on the counter. And I would lose my ever loving mind. It got to the point where like the boys and Jason would not be anywhere near, like they would not be in the vicinity. They knew better than to be around when I got home. And doing that sober was pretty horrible. I think when we engage in our strategies when we're sober and increasing in consciousness, I think A, there's a great potential for us to change them. And B, there's also a great potential for us to find it profoundly painful and disappointing and experience a lot of shame around how we show up. But one of the things that I realized was that coming home moment was very hard for me. And I didn't really know why. I'd never actually put my attention on it. So I just knew in my sobriety, I was like, I'm going to do whatever I can. And, like if you can't see, like I'm actually gripping very tightly with both my hands, like I'm holding on. Because for me to lose my shit, I started to realize that there were emotional and physiological consequences every time I got angry.
Yes. And I want to actually segue there and I want to ask you a question because I feel like we're headed in this direction, right? And I would just love to like go there. But part of what you share is the way that going through a really serious illness was part of your transformation, right? Kind of part of that like healing crisis, right? And, how do you think that the emotions that you were holding in and letting kind of fester in you and explode so regularly were part of that illness process?
Yeah, that is like such a great question. I want to speak to like two things before I answer that. One is that, and this is the story I'm making up in my head, so you can correct me, but like you've sort of described that there've been some cycles or some ebbs and flows in your relationship. And there've been some, big sensational sorts of, interactions and sometimes really connected and then sometimes really sort of moving in and out of that connection. If I got that right. And I think that that's really normal and natural part of just being a human and in relationship. And that sort of ebbing and flowing has a lot to do with how we relate to our own interior world and how conscious we are about what's happening inside. Like when I would drive in the driveway, there was a point where I was not conscious that I was exhausted, that I was really, really depleted. Like it wasn't just that I was tired from a 13-hour day. It was that I was thin and like almost nothing left emotionally and physically. I also went through a period, like this was sort of an early period of the illness where I was having a migraine every single day for a year and a half. And I was working and I was running like 30 to 40 miles a week. And I was, parenting two preteens. And I was teaching yoga because I was a yoga teacher and have been for like 25 years. I mean, my life was so overwhelming. And I did not know that I actually had a very hard time feeling. So I would drive in the driveway and not have any conscious awareness of what my state was, how empty my tank might be. And that when I would walk in the house, it would be like the moment that I could just finally come apart. And I did not know how to come apart in a way that wasn't like an explosion. And as I think as we know ourselves more, one of the things that we can start to see is like, oh, I call it layers of vulnerability, or maybe sort of layers of liability, even like
Mm.
some detriment. Like for me, a 13-hour day, and this is actually how I ended up leaving nursing. Ultimately, I came to realize that that's not tenable for my body, period. And there's no way I can do that and be well.
Mm.
For many, many years, I insisted that I could do that and run 30 to 40 miles a week and teach, 3 to 5 yoga classes a week and study and do another 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours of like teacher trainings. I mean, I think I've done like 1,000 hours of yoga teacher trainings. So I was always, always, always doing too much. And that was purposeful. I mean, that was part of how I kept myself from feeling. It was
Mhm.
driven by the idea that this next thing will make me feel better. Now, that's not conscious. I don't think a lot of people are
Right.
walking around saying, oh, this next thing. I mean, sometimes like I'll be happy when, but I don't think that that was a loud thought in my conscious awareness. It was like, it was kind of like this, oh, I've got to do this thing. I've got
It
to
was like
reach for
a
that.
compulsion. It was like an urge, like a something
Yeah.
driving you, not
Yeah.
even like wanting necessarily.
Driven is a way that a lot of people used to describe me. Relentless is now how I describe myself, but I mean that in like the most like exalted way, but like driven. And so, even though so much of what I did was in the realm of feeling, like yoga and koya, which is like dance, yoga, prayer, I did a lot of therapy. Eventually, I started doing women's work. Even though it was so much in the realm of feeling, I really, in retrospect, realized that I spent much of my childhood dissociated. I
From your body, right? And from those pathways in your body that can sense and feel. And I can completely relate to so much of what you're saying. I'm sure there's people listening who, understand what you're speaking to on a very deep level, because part of the value of doing this internal sensing, feeling work, right, which is some somatic work ultimately of coming home and back into ourselves and our bodies, is that we build pathways to sense and feel that we didn't have before. So I used to
mm,
kind of look back and go like, oh, like why did I do all these heartless things? Why did I do all these terrible things? How could I be like teaching yoga while living in chronic pain, pretending that I had all the answers when I'm like limping up the stairs to teach class? Like I went through all that. And it's like I
yeah,
look back and I go, I just didn't have the pathways to do something different. There
yeah,
wasn't a choice. It wasn't like I was choosing to, break up with that poor guy that way. You know what I mean?
right,
It's not
right,
like you were choosing to come inside and throw a fit. It wasn't a
yeah,
choice. It was a well-worn pathway of how things happen in my body. And until we have another pathway that gets built alongside those old ones and those old ones get pruned, it's kind of like a suffice to say we don't know better, but it's not no, it's we don't feel
yeah.
that we don't sense and feel another way to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's not a one and done, like, oh, now I can feel. I mean, this has been a long healing away layer by layer. Like I think about this because I do also hear this particular thing. So if people who are listening, have this thought of like, well, I've been doing this for so long.
Yes. Mhm.
I've been at this for so long. I just want to say, like, yep, you have. And nothing has been wasted and everything has been like purposeful. And there's no arriving. Like, if you came into this life for growth, and that is absolutely what I came here for, was to like explore the
Flourish.
absolute
Mm.
horizons, the horizontal edge, the growing edge of what is possible and, what's here for us to experience. I know I'm constantly going to be experiencing some sort of challenge, some sort of opening. So that's the prelude to this piece around being able to feel, like my work with mothers and babies, like that work was so important for my own sort of emotional maturation because I really clearly understood that I was being drawn into a kind of work where I didn't know that I had this capacity. I didn't really know how, I don't even still have a word for it, but where I could walk into a room and I could feel everything that was happening inside of the mother's body. I could feel everything happening inside of the baby's body. I could feel her sort of emotional world and how it was meeting her experience of becoming a mother. I could feel her mother's story and whatever was sort of populating that. And my work ultimately became not just like sort of clinically administering care, and my intellect really loved that part, but was my work really became learning how to translate what was happening in the baby's body in a language that the mother could understand emotionally so that she could attune to the baby. And to do that, I actually had to learn how to feel everything that I was feeling. And believe me, a lot of the stuff that I would feel would be like, holy shit, this is very intense. I mean, I've seen and experienced a lot of profoundly devastating things in my career as a nurse in patients' rooms. But that ability to feel and sense, I always talked about breastfeeding as, like helping you and your baby just to be good mammals, like to have a body and to allow the senses, like to learn how to trust the senses. And that breastfeeding was just a language for me to talk about attunement and being in her body as a mother, as a woman, and being able to respond and sense another body that you are, having a dyadic experience with. And that the sensing, like that babies explore the world through their mouth. Mm-hmm. It's breastfeeding, feeding itself is not just calories coming in, that it is a neurological, biochemical, psychobiological, sociological experience for a baby to use their mouth. And when they breastfeed, they actually are engaging in a very complex relationship with their world, which is the mother, for the first period of their life. And there's this really interesting sort of passage from Jamie Wheel's book called Recapture the Rapture, where he talks about, and I'm going to probably not get all the details right, but he talks about this thing that was developed for the Navy SEALs to be able to navigate very dark depths of water. And it's this little thing that goes on their tongue, and it basically gives them information about which way to go. And I was like, oh, that's what babies are doing. They are using their mouth to navigate the world. And so when we really grok that we are sensate beings, meaning our senses are forms of information about our relationship and orientation to the world, to our environment, and that we could say that a feeling is a sensation, an emotion is an energy in motion in the body. And when we can really be able to experience sensation in the body without a judgment or story attached, which is how Rochelle Sheik taught me that sensuality is feeling or sensing without a judgment or story attached. So when a woman can feel and feel herself in the present moment through her senses, because that's how we know we're right here, right now, and we can experience life moving through us as various forms of information in the form of emotions or sensations, and not be attached to what that might mean about us, then we actually are in a relationship with life and our life and this vehicle that we came into in order to, this sacred place where our soul meets form. And when we start to understand that is actually a very practical thing, it sounds like very metaphysical language, but it's actually a very practical thing of like, can you feel one thing in this moment and stay with it? That's for me, like when I was able to start getting that as a whole piece, was when I started to understand how much I had suppressed myself in my life in order to function in the relational world that I grew up in. Because my health issues were all about suppression. I had hypo everything, like low everything. And I ended up with a mold-related illness that became basically an autoimmune disaster. And that experience really taught me that if I wanted to be well, I would have to learn how to bring consciousness into every part of my body. And this is
Mm.
after like 20 years of practicing yoga
Yeah.
already, right? Like, it's not like I'm like, oh, and I'm going to go become a yogi. I mean, it's like I'd already been doing this.
Yeah.
And that illness actually brought me face to face with if I'm going to feel, if I'm going to be capable of feeling, there's certain scenarios that are way outside my capacity. Like I can't work 13-hour days and feel like the work itself, the intensity, the chronic
Right.
like stress of just like
Drains you. It uses
totally.
all of those resources and there's nothing left, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, my biology, if I'm going to be awake and feeling and in touch with myself and connected myself, I actually, it blows my circuits to sit, to be somewhere where you can't pee for 4 or 5 hours because your patients are such an emergent priority. You don't eat lunch until 5:30 in the afternoon. Like I just can't live that way. And this is the big piece that I wanted to point out to around senses, emotions, feeling, and our health is that I'd constructed my life on purpose, not necessarily consciously, but my life was constructed based on who I thought I had to be
Mm.
and who I showed up as in order to stay safe in the world. And that if I was going to heal, I actually would have to be someone else, meaning my life would have to look very different, which meant that I would have to make choices. Like I would have to leave a career. I'm a fourth generation nurse.
Mm.
So I would have to leave something that was an identity. I was very good at what I did. It was intellectually very stimulating. It was deeply satisfying. And if I was going to heal and actually like have a life housed inside of myself, I would actually have to be someone else and I would have to leave the life I've had. And I think that that is part of why we want the answer to be somebody else.
Mm.
I think it's part of why it's so hard to feel because there are certain conditions that are actually required for an
Yeah.
mammal to feel.
Right. And, one of my mentors calls that space of like kind of being on that edge of like the unknown. He calls it the zone of incomprehensibility. Like if, you can't comprehend, you can't expect, or, it's not you, if you're going to become a different person and your life is going to be different than it was, you don't know what that looks like until you start along the path and just start walking into the woods and figure out where to step so that you don't get, prickles on your leg, right? Like it's definitely that territory into the unknown, right? The
Mhm.
incomprehensible. And that, I think you hit it right on the head. Like, that's why we want the answer to be somebody else has to change. Somebody else has to, do what I want them to do or what I think needs to be done, right? Because it's harder to put ourselves in that vulnerable space of not knowing who we are going to be if we take a pivot and we let go, right? Because that's what you had to do. You
Mhm.
had to let go of a whole lot.
Yeah. I mean, that pivot is like, that is one big fucking pivot. It's like the whole, like, watch out for that first step. It's a doozy. It really is. It's like, and here's the thing, I wouldn't have done what I did that ended up opening up a world in terms of love I never even actually envisioned. Like extraordinary love was not something I thought, oh, I'm meant for this. I did not even reach for that or dare imagine that. Psychedelic pleasure in my body was not something I'm like, oh girl, I'm so down with that. I didn't even like aspire to that.
Uh-huh.
The only way that I got there was that my life basically said, wheels are coming off. Like you either stop, like this. I love this quote that the goddess will, if you don't see the goddess in health, she'll see you in illness.
Mm.
And like I got thumped on the head by whatever we want to call it. I have my patroness goddess and relationship to her. And I believe she thumped me on the head and she was like, look, I'm going to hold you down under my thumb until you relent.
Mm.
And that was a profound couple of years long depression that just wiped out any aspiration, any drive, any desire to even be here on this mortal coil. It was like the darkest of dark nights that seemed to go on forever. And then within a short period of that sort of seeming to relent, a very profound illness that cleared the board in the rest of my life. Like what didn't get taken out by the dark night got taken out by the illness. And I think when we strip our life down to the studs, then we really start to meet who we actually are. And it's never who we think.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like this conversation is really taking some very the broadness of what it really means to have a healthy, mature relationship that is satisfying, right? Like I'm feeling into kind of the depth of where you're coming from when you talk about these things, and it isn't just going to be like some affirmations that we say or some, some cute little like exercises that we do. It's going to be a long form transformation of the kind of core of who we have been being and unwrapping and unraveling the things that have been getting in the way. And I think that with my modality, with the specific kind of somatic work that I do, I like to describe it as an undoing because so many things, even things that are very, very good for us, are a doing. Sitting in
Mm-hmm.
seated meditation, maybe it's an undoing of some thoughts if, you're good at that kind of awareness, right? But it's a physical doing. It's holding yourself upright in a position, doing a thing. And what you've kind of described is like the way that illness undoes us. It is forcing you to literally just lay in bed. And I've thought about that a lot with like negative thought patterns and depression and things like this. It's a very somatic experience. Numbness is a sensation, right? It's not this mental thing that we pretend that it is. It is a physical experience in our bodies that is not allowing us to get up out of bed and put clothes on and take a shower and all those things, right? And
Yeah.
so when we're in that level of like freeze, I've learned to, first of all, go with it and trust it. Maybe it's just going to last the afternoon. Maybe it's just going to last the day. If I start resisting it and making myself wrong for it, and not letting myself actually rest in it, right? Because what if all those negative thought patterns and all that despair was my body's super smart, intelligent way of getting me to undo and not do anything more right
Yes.
now?
Yes. Yeah. I think that is a move that's so hard for so many women, especially like really smart, soulful, highly competent, can slay tall shit and single bound, have realized a lot maybe in their external lives. That is such a painful insistence that comes from, for me, it felt like it came from somewhere outside of me, like there wasn't the trigger, like the sort of triggering event that sort of took me into the depression, was not something I would have thought, oh, that's the match, or that's the thing that sort of moved, it was unaccountable at the time. And I had a very same experience of really reckoning with like, okay, if this isn't going to move, if there's nothing that is going to make this different, and everybody has their own approach. I actually did go on an antidepressant for a period of time because I was so terrified, because I was actually thinking about like, it wouldn't be a problem if I just went off the road here. And so yeah, so terrified. And the physical sensation, like when you said that, I was like, I actually I had sort of this body memory of like, oh God, I remember what that felt like to, yeah, it was like an ache. It was just so wide. And there is something about, how I describe it now is like when you get into this place of no exit, like a doorless hallway where all of the doors are closing, there's no exit available. And there's something about just finally relenting to feel what is actually there, like to actually feel the depth of my despair, to feel like, sort of like inching along at like the bottom of my heart where there's like no, like it felt like there was nothing, to touch. And, like the kind of voidness that a depression can feel like. It was such existential despair, and making the shift of like, okay, if this isn't going anywhere, could I simply feel without making it wrong, like you said, like without pathologizing myself. And meanwhile, like I had a very horrible eating disorder and like had to go through a very similar process with the eating disorder of like, if I just didn't make this wrong, if I could see this as the smartest thing that my psyche figured out to do, the eating disorder, if I could see this as the smartest thing my psyche has figured out to do, the depression, the anxiety, what could I become aware of? And it was that pivot, like with the eating disorder, because I purged and it was pretty bad for I mean, I had some kind of ever morphing eating disorder for many decades, but the final years of it were sort of about the same time. And when I could finally make that pivot and say, like, what if purging was the wisest thing I have somehow figured out to do? And it was that pivot that made me start to actually ask myself, okay, well, what am I actually experiencing? And this might be hard for some people to hear. I'm not going to give gory details, but like, what is it that I'm actually experiencing when I purge?
Mm.
And I started to kind of diagram it. Like there's this intense terror and fear and overwhelm. It's so loud. It's like an air siren were going off in my head. And then afterwards, it's nothing.
Mm.
I just feel, I think it was,
Calm, kind of after the storm.
well, comfortably numb. Like everything is sort of obliterated. And I was like, oh, this is going to sound so obvious. I must be in a lot of pain that I need to do this to
Yeah.
get to some like
Relief. You get relief from it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me the metaphor of like not being able to take in nourishment, not being able to hold it in my body, not being able to accept it, to self harm around my own needs. Like these are all metaphors.
Yes.
And I was like, there might be something going on around the vagus nerve here because that is a lot of stimulation of the vagus nerve.
Yeah, that's getting you that relief or that sense of like nothingness that you are getting from that. And I love that you are speaking to this because I think that when we realize that sometimes there's like a payoff, we can even vilify that there's a payoff. Like, oh, I'm getting something from this. And we make ourselves wrong for getting something from it instead of going, oh, wow, I must be in so much pain that this thing that is quote unquote harmful is providing me relief from my suffering for a moment in time. And that shows me the depth of how much suffering I'm experiencing. And then, you went right there with the vagus nerve in terms of the physiological aspect of it, which is, I thought about that with like when people are yelling, when they get upset, they're stimulating their vagus nerve. They're helping themselves feel better for a moment.
Absolutely. I mean, that, like I said, like earlier, I mentioned, like I was a rager. I yelled, and there would be a huge, sort of consequence to that emotionally and relationally, but also physiologically. I started, in my sobriety, I was like, oh, wow, this is really depleting. But there's also a payoff. There's a dopamine payoff. There is a sort of a nervous system payoff, like the something gets opened up and released. But I think that this is like if someone who's listening can hear this, I think what you and I are pointing to is such a profound, I just think it's like a genius move, which is to respect our resistance, to respect our patterns, respect our adaptations. And by respect, I mean to look at them again,
Yes.
to turn, I was a practiced yogi. So and a practiced meditator. So I knew what it was to be like, oh, here's like, I'm sitting in meditation and there's my story, like I'm a bad mother story. And I would just put a little label on it and kind of float away. And I would go back to like whatever, my mantra, my breath. But to be able to do that same thing in our moment to moment life of like, okay, here I am. I'm about to do the same thing of, that I've done before. Can I stay conscious?
Mm-hmm.
Can I stay conscious right here? And I even did something really, very unconventional. And that is that, at a certain point in the last couple of years of my eating disorder, I first of all told my husband because he discovered me one day standing outside of the bathroom when I opened the door. And he said, are you purging? And I was terrified and humiliated and deeply ashamed. And I said, yes. And he said, you do not ever have to be ashamed with me.
Mm.
And that was all he said. And I got the message clearly that he also did not want me lying to him and hiding things. So at a certain point, I said, I'm going to tell you every time I purge.
Mm.
And I'm just going to, admit it before I do it and try to take the shame out of it because I can't seem to stop doing it no matter how I try. And my therapist was like, stop trying to stop purging. And so for a year and a half, the final year and a half of my eating disorder, I would tell him. And for part of that, it was every day.
Oh, wow.
And some days he would say, I love you. You don't have to do this. And some days he would say, I love you. And I'm here if you need me. And he never stopped me, which was very wise because he knows better than to fight with a very driven woman. But the thing that it helped me do was to normalize the pain that I was in. actually really listen to it. And that's the sort of befriending of our suffering. Like I think part of the ticket in,
Yes.
for this ride in a human experience, it comes with suffering. Nobody gets out of that.
Right. Yeah, and what you're speaking to also is just you're building through the unshaming of the act, through the sharing and the connecting, and letting yourself be seen in it. You're opening yourself up to a larger container for all of it to be held in, which is a container of grace, which is the
Mm.
container of love, right? And that the behavior and the thing and the bad, wrong thing doesn't even have to change for that grace to start becoming available and there and present alongside the habit, is not sustainable, right? I
Yeah.
think that's like, it's like a lot of times we want to just skip ahead to the part where we don't do that anymore. And and like,
If
just
somebody can do that,
yeah.
like please, like let us know.
Yeah, but it's like but the thing is when we go too fast in our transformation and we jump ahead, we have to backtrack and clean up the things that we dropped and the little cracks and the errors that we made along the way. We have to go circle back because, change, and I love the timelines that you've been giving in this conversation for your process to be really clear and realistic for people that, oh, this didn't just change in 3 months. This didn't just shift. You just spoke to a year and a half or something like that of telling your husband that, when you were purging, of being in that last leg of your journey where you're bringing in that awareness and that grace and that kindness, right? Even as you're not stopping, you can't stop at that point. And I think that's really important for people to hear is that, to let go of a deeply held pattern that you've been, and I love the word adaptation that you've been using, that's been giving you something, that's been helping you and supporting you, even as much as it's hard for you to like maybe see that. It's not a short, quick one and done, as you said. It is a process, and it's worth it to go through that process because on the other side of it is a whole new way of experiencing your body, your life. I'm assuming it was a whole new way now of taking in nutrition and being oriented towards, not just food, but like receiving, right? Receiving and allowing your body to digest life. So maybe you can say a bit about like, how all of this relates to like your relationship with your husband.
That's such a great question because I was actually thinking about that. The timeline is really interesting in that I had this really intense depression. Things in my life just sort of got reordered. And when I finally admitted that I was depressed and sought some kind of, movement forward, like I finally said, hey, I raised my hand. I'm like, I need help here. And that was like after 2 years. One of the things that I decided was that I had to actually once and for all figure out, I didn't even think about it, like heal. I was so done with that language, but once and for all, end the disordered eating disorder, like end all of that stuff. And that took me a full 2 years because the eating disorder model didn't really fully work for me. The medical model didn't totally really work for me. The spiritual models really didn't work for me all that much. And the 12-step model helped some, but it didn't go the whole way. And so I had to sort of cobble together my own process. And that took a full 2 years from basically completely defining for myself what the eating disorder was, all the behaviors, all of the things that I did, all of the things I thought. So beginning to end was like about 2 years. End meaning like I stopped purging. Like one day, like that was the last thing to go.
Mm.
Weirdly, all the other things I could do, but the purging was the last to go. And within a couple months after that, so that's like a 4-year period, depression, working through the eating disorder, sort of basic clawing myself back into life. Like I took a very easy job where I could just get out of my own head for a year. Within a couple months, our marriage transformed. Now I'd been doing other things and we'd been sort of walking on, like walking through a process that really didn't get a lot of traction. But within a couple months of finally putting the last piece of the eating disorder away, it became really clear to me that I did not have the first fucking clue how to have intimacy. And that the eating disorder was, in the words of one of my teachers, an exit. It was, as Terry Real would say, a misery stabilizer. It was one of the exits. It like allowed me to not feel the distress of living in an emotionally lifeless, zero passion, mostly roommate marriage. So when the eating disorder was sort of put to bed, then I was like, oh, now I actually know what I've been not paying attention to, including how profoundly lonely it felt for me to be with somebody who was equally sort of checked out.
Yeah.
It wasn't just me. We are always and only ever with somebody who's like meets us in terms of their consciousness. I was very like arrogant and thought I had more consciousness, but it was like once that exit closed. And so I think if we can identify the exits that we're using, overwork, over functioning, eating disorders, alcohol, shopping, other like special relationships, mothering, like whatever they are, like whatever those exits are, if we are willing to close them, because that is a requirement in order to really see what am I dealing with in my relationship. A healthy relationship that flourishes, that we can actually work on, requires a safe, sane environment. And that means we close our exits. I think that's from Harville Hendricks, is the term exit. That was really when we started cooking with gas, as they say. And it did not take long. We'd done therapy a couple of times. It didn't really do a lot for us. We'd tried a lot of different things, but I'd say it was within the year, but certainly within, I'd say 6 months, our marriage started to really look and feel very different. And within a year, we were in a profoundly different marriage. And that was like years and years of like a lead up.
Yeah. Yeah. So then can you maybe describe a little more detail on like these transformations that you had been going through were obviously like a huge catalyst for him, you know, were you in a sense like leading this by closing your exits first? And did he follow? What had happened for him as he saw you going through this whole process, right? And what kind of dynamic did you have for his side of things? Because I think there are like probably women listening and they're thinking like, oh, well, I know I'll do all these things, but he won't, right? Like,
yeah, that is a very, I think, durable wish, is that like I can do these things and hopefully he'll change, or I've been doing all the work and he just won't.
right.
Now, this is not a guarantee. Like when we change, there is no guarantee that other people will. But by the law of resonance, if we truly change and inhabit that change, the world around us can't not.
Yeah.
Now that means he might either come further in, wake up, shift, become more receptive, want to do his work, or he might move further out and actually be sort of like be moved away from your world. That is the risk. Mm-hmm. Like there is no guarantee that when, a woman really honors who she is and very deliberately honors her non-negotiables, but in a relational way, there's no guarantee that he's going to be like, sign me up. However, I've known a lot of men in my life. I've had a lot of men in my life. My best friend is a man. I have 2 sons who are adults. I've known my husband for 32 years, and nearly every single man that I even dated from high school, if they're still alive, I am still friends with them. So I've been very fortunate to have a lot of men in my life. And there's one thing that I do know about men is one, that most men are good. Most men are good men, well-intentioned. Just like us, they may not be fully awake. They may not be awake in certain ways. They may have their own relationship-ish, but I believe that most men, like most women, are fundamentally good. And that I think the men, at least in our culture, are profoundly responsive to a woman who can hold herself with integrity, emotional integrity, and is deeply feeling and can do that in a relationally responsive way. And that most men are very responsive and will rise to a standard or a request that's made in a relational way. So right. By that, what I mean is one of the things that I learned to do was, first of all, stop all the feminine embodiment fluffernutter and the feminine communication, which was really just like a sort of thinly veiled manipulation. Sorry.
I love it. I love it.
That is how I feel.
I agree. That's a whole podcast we could do.
It's a whole podcast. I'm really grateful for that little bit of resonance there. And I learned to actually express something that was painful, like how much the absence of his presence, his emotional presence, his tuned outness, his sort of habitual tuned outness, how much that hurt. Whereas for most of my life before, for most of our marriage before, all I expressed was anger and contempt and resentment, even though I thought I was doing it in like, I feel when you language that is also, I think, just veiled criticism. But I started to be able to say, like, it is so deeply lonely for me in our marriage. And I didn't know at the time. I mean, I've really spent the last 4 or 5 years reverse engineering what happened, because I want this for every woman. I want every woman to have like an outrageously happy, epic love story in their relationship. And what I didn't know was that I was actually learning how to express what was true for me as an emotion or a perception from a self-responsible place. So it was about me, not about him.
Right.
I am lonely. I feel profoundly lonely. When you read on some device and never reach for me, and I'm sitting right next to you for, the 3 hours before we go to bed or 2 hours before we go to bed, I feel deeply lonely. And I don't know if I can take that anymore. And there was something that happened. There was something that happened in our life. We were part of a group of couples led by some people who had been friends of ours. And it was a sort of witnessing experience. And my husband, like completely to my great shock, was willing to participate in that. He'd been very much like a no to any kind of men's work, any kind of anything. Like we'd tried couples therapy twice and it was just like a huge blowout. I mean, not an argument, but just like it was a wash. And we were in this couples group. And this was the thing that really, really changed for me was, we were being witnessed in a conversation about like anger I felt, the hurt that I felt. And I was trying to express it responsibly, like from my own side, not as about him, but my feelings. And the group was designed so that people would give feedback, but feedback as in like, okay, this is something that I saw. And one of the men said, and I don't really even remember the content of it, but it was actually probably the most empathically loving witnessing that I'd ever received from a man. Like basically, like I can see how much pain you're in. And I can't really describe it, but in that moment, I saw something that my husband had been doing in our marriage really forever, which is like my husband's adaptation to the world that he grew up in was to be receded, like not there, like we might call it like not present or shut down or withdrawn, or sort of like he would say, I love you. And I knew that he would believe that, but it never moved towards me. He never acted towards me. It was never like expressed towards me. And something clicked for me when I realized, my husband's mother was a profoundly unkind, highly critical, very rejecting mother. And in his childhood, he told me, I didn't know this until, just a couple of years ago, he was an only child. His parents had a child before him who died before my husband was born. His brother died in childhood. And Jason told me that he would, in his bedroom at night, 5, 6, 7 years old, he had this little sort of incantation that was hearless, feelless, invisible. No, hearless, feelless, wantless. As a child, he would say this to himself: hearless, feelless, wantless. Like, I don't hear anything. I don't feel anything. I don't want anything, as a child. And I realized in that moment, and I can't believe it took me this long, that in all of our marriage, my raging, my being angry, my being contemptuous, I was showing up just like his mother.
Right. And you were putting him into that adaptation.
And his adaptation to his relational trauma was to be hearless, feelless, and wantless. And here I was enraged at him that he didn't want me. Like I was contributing to that. And that was a profoundly painful moment to realize that I actually was feeding into something that justified his adaptation. And in that moment, I was like, I never, ever, ever want to show up as that person in our marriage again. And really looked deeply at how I behaved. Like, what was my tone of voice? How did I express things? Did I ever express gratitude? Did I ever express appreciation? And no, I really did not. I mean, really, I
Yeah.
I was so arrogant. I'm like, I'm a yogi. I've got perfect posture. I know all the ways to be in blah, blah, blah. Like it's just such fucking bullshit. And I really did not know how to nurture and tend and respond to a man. I did not know how to appreciate him. I did not know I wasn't actually even seeing him. Like there's something about that experience that like a veil fell away and I actually started to see who this person was in front of me and
Yeah.
realized that if I wanted a relationship with him, and this was the same thing I realized with my kids many years earlier when they were teenagers, is that if they were going to want a relationship with me, I had better figure out how to be someone that they wanted to have a relationship with
Oh,
when they
yeah.
grew up. And the same thing with my husband. Like I really needed to become fit for a relationship. And that shift, like this was all some of the things that came up in that sort of year of transformation. And I could never have tolerated seeing my part in our marriage if I had still been engaged in a self-harming, perpetuating self-hating behavior like an eating disorder.
Right. It
Like,
would have been too painful. It would have been unavailable. I was thinking about that as you were speaking, because when you have those moments of going like, oh my God, like I see like what I've been doing. I see like how I've been being, right? And again, like creating a little bit of grace for yourself in the sense of like you were functioning at a deficit energetically. There was like a hole inside of you, an endless
mm-hmm.
pit of needing and wanting and desiring that like love and attention, but like not letting yourself receive it. I mean, that kind of describes the eating disorder in a way, right? Is
Absolutely.
so,
Hungry ghost.
yes. And so then it's like once you, as you described, like close those exits where like that's not the thing that you're doing anymore. Now there's this re-nourishing of yourself. And then now you're not functioning from that place of intense deficit. There's capacity now to approach looking at yourself and looking at some of the behaviors and things, right? And seeing them for what they are instead of it being like it's just gonna push you beyond your capacity. It's not even gonna be an option when you're still in that, like you said, the self-harm mode.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that having a deeply satisfying, outrageously happy relationship and marriage is totally possible. I think that we can be contented on the daily, that actually can be our baseline, but it takes capacity.
Yeah.
And that capacity is my responsibility.
Hmm.
It's, and for my husband, like his part, that's his responsibility. And the thing that happened for him was that he started to feel like I took my sticky little paws off of him and like put my attention on myself and really started to ask myself, like, who would I have to be in order to know myself as a woman who was wanted by her man? Not even by him per se, like the object wasn't him, but was like, could I change my attention so that I tuned in deeply to like, who would I have to be showing up as? How would I have to see myself? How would I have to see my world? What would I have to be capable of feeling in order to be wanted by the person I was in a relationship with? So it was less about him wanting me, but more about like who was on this side of it.
Yeah.
And when I started to do that and really pay attention to like, could I feel with him? Could I, feel some part of our connection and just really deeply enjoy that for what it is, not like for what it isn't, like yet
Mm.
more proof that he's insufficient. But could I really just relish what we had in each moment? And then from that place, if there was something else that I wanted, ask like, oh, it feels so good. Would you, like as an invitation to join me in a
Right.
place that felt good as opposed to him doing something for me. And within a very short period of time of asking myself that question, like a month, like suddenly he's, we're laughing a lot and he's calling me adorable. That's where adored woman comes from. Saying, I adore you, something he's never ever said in our life, starting to say things like, I feel so blessed, which was also language he's never ever used. I actually looked at him. I was like, where the fuck did you get that word? I was like totally shocked. Like he would be like saying, you're so sexy. Our sex life started to like get very alive. And after about a month, there was one Saturday where I folding clothes or something, doing chores, and I said, "Can I talk to you for a minute? And we sat down on the end of the bed. I was like, what the fuck has just happened to us? Like, what has happened? And he said, I don't know. I could feel your heart. And I realized I could feel my own.
Fantastic. Yes. This is such an amazing, such an inspirational story and arc that you've been sharing with us. We're going to be kind of winding our conversation down, and I actually want to ask kind of a closing question, just kind of, it gets a little more on like the technical side of some of the things that you've been talking about, which I'm guessing is part of your work with a person, right? But you've mentioned this a couple of times. What are some examples of non-negotiables?
Ooh, such a good question. I'll give you like one of my husband's non-negotiables is no demonstrations or communications of contempt, no eye rolling, no sarcasm, no verbal unkindness, no name calling. Essentially, like a non-negotiable is really no emotional violence, and sarcasm. I'm sorry, folks, that actually constitutes emotional violence. It's
Yeah.
passive aggressive. So non-negotiables really, for me, they're more behavioral, how someone thinks and feels. I can't control that. Like I can't say, yeah, my non-negotiable is that he desire me. Desire is so complex, so complicated, but how he shows up, yeah, like being present in our life, being willing to have conversations, there's a way to kind of get more defined in those. But non-negotiables are really relational behaviors. And a lot of the non-negotiables start with no, like no this, no that, like what I will and won't tolerate. And that no is what both that no starts to create a space for a big old juicy yes.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Yeah, that's a really great piece for people to contemplate here about the sarcasm and the eye rolling and the passive aggressiveness as actual violence, because we see that a lot. We see it depicted in movies. It's part of contemporary humor, all these things. And yet at the same time, it doesn't feel good when someone is doing that to you in a conversation where you're trying
Yeah.
to actually communicate with each other. When there's actual communication that's trying to occur and somebody's rolling their eyes at you, it shuts doors for communication and it feels horrible, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It really undermines relationality. It eviscerates the relational space. And I mean that quite metaphorically, like it will eviscerate a relationship.
Yeah,
And
thank you for saying that.
yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has just been such a wonderful conversation. I feel like we could talk for like 2 more hours. I'm sure we would find so many fun, interesting paths to wander down and bring us back to a lot of these like very fundamental, conclusions, right? If our audience, right, is interested in knowing more about how to work with you, where to find you, can you tell us a little bit about if you have a project coming up or an offer, or if there is something like, yeah, what do you have
Yeah.
going on?
Thank you. Yeah, I work primarily with women and couples. I work with women one on one and couples one on two, obviously, in my private coaching practice. And I have my first 3-month journey, The Way of the Adored Woman, coming up. This is really the centerpiece of my work. This, I believe, is what I was put here to do. And it's a 3-month journey. It could be a 3-year journey, but I thought 3 months was a good start. And it's for 12 women. And applications opened February 14th, of course, but it's already filling because there are a lot of women in my world, women who follow me primarily on Facebook, who are already a big yes. And we start on March 11th, which is a very auspicious day, astrologically speaking, which I did not know. Somebody just told me this for this kind of work. But March 11th is also our 30th anniversary. And so either working with me in the group, The Way of the Adored Woman, or one-on-one. And most people find me through Facebook. I do a lot of writing. You can sometimes see me do video things there. And if you friend me on Facebook and message me, I love to connect with people. That's really a great joy for me. And I have a Substack that is a little less, populated, but I am there from time to time too.
Fantastic. Yes. Well, if you're listening and you've enjoyed this conversation, follow Kristy. I follow her writing, and I love that, with Facebook as opposed to Instagram, you can really do those longer form pieces of writing and really share things more in depth, right? So give her a follow on there, connect with her, check out The Way of the Adored Woman. And thank you so much for coming on, for saying yes to this interview. It's been incredibly enriching for me on a personal level, and I'm sure for so many other people who are listening to this podcast today.
Thank you so much, Amy. This was just such a pleasure. I love that it felt like we could talk forever.
Absolutely. All right, until next time.
Thanks.
Hey there, friend. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I would love to hear your thoughts. Follow me on Instagram at Amy Takaya and send me a DM about this episode. I'd like to thank you for being part of this somatic revolution. And if you'd like to support the podcast and help more people learn about somatics, consider leaving a review or a rating. And finally, if you'd like to have the experience of relief in your tight hips or back and learn to understand what your body is really saying to you, visit youcanfreeyoursoma.com. I can't wait to share with you what is truly possible. Bye for now.